字。疯狂卖货，我要疯狂卖货，我早搁这嗷嗷喊着卖了。你是中国人吗？刚关注的啊，这新来的，我是中国人。你喜欢中国吗？我就中国人，我不喜欢中国，我喜欢哪儿？啊，再见再见啊，对。哎呦，我还没搞俄语再过见。大腿蛋呢？下次见。
Petrov, or Dong Desheng, arguably the most famous Russian Chinese, was born and raised in a small northern Manchuria village called Bianjiang, the frontier. It borders Russia's Amur Oblast to the north across the Amur River. Among 1,084 villagers, 327 are ethnic Russians. Most of them are the descendants of the White Russian soldiers. Petrov's great-grandfather was a Cossack officer under Tsar Nicholas II. Ever since he fled to China in 1926, none of his descendants had returned to Russia.
来信了，说不定就问题大了就。
Mao Zedong denounces the Khrushchev doctrine.
感觉自己觉着心里不舒服。
中苏关系一不好了，完了就没来了，完了就他妈就剩在这儿了。
你跟那边是有什么关系？是不是有联系？就把我爷爷就给打成叫休特，苏休特嘛，特务。
看谁还能念一念。
再早吧，咱这样人可能受歧视。
因为咱们就是不，我们不说中国多落后，咱们在70年代比较还是有。
Deng Xiaoping came along at just the right moment.
你说你是假冒的，中国没有俄罗斯。
80年左右吧，就给平反了。平反嘛，就是搁这个事儿吧，就给我们家有点阴影。来，爷爷，
再唱一遍。二姐，再唱一遍。再来一遍，二姐。
我也不知道我现在做的。
还没卡，你再来一遍。
我也是，没办法，原谅孙子。
The experience of the Korean War cast a shadow over Sino-Soviet relations. The Chinese leaders were disappointed by the Soviet decision. It was one of the arguments that Mao expressed later on with the Soviet leaders that Moscow simply betrayed China. Mao later told the Soviet ambassador to Beijing, Pavel Yuzhin, "You Russians have never had faith in the Chinese people, and Stalin was among the worst." The Soviet Union's failure to deliver its promises of military support during the Korean War convinced Mao that China had to become self-sufficient. Later that year, Mao unleashed the first 5-year plan to increase China's industrial output and was determined to transform China into a power no one could ignore. Cooperation nevertheless flourished in the early 1950s, and on the surface, Sino-Soviet relations appeared strong. The Soviets even returned the CER to the Chinese, the first time CER had been under full Chinese control since the railway was constructed in 1898. As the Soviets withdrew their influence from Manchuria, their influence in Xinjiang remained strong. When Xinjiang was officially designated an autonomous region in 1955, Soviet citizens made up more than 12% of Xinjiang's population and held a high number of administrative positions across the province. In addition, the Xinjiang elites before the 1950s were all educated in the Soviet Union and spoke Russian. Russian songs, movies, and operas were popular among the locals. Even hospital prescriptions and street signs were in Russian.
我父亲以前是南京医科大毕业的，毕业了以后在自区2医院工作 55年支援这个边境城市，资源到这儿来的。我母亲是在自治区妇联幼儿园，完了到这儿来是我们塔城地区幼儿园的第一创始人，母亲是。
Soviet experts and elites were sent to China till the late 1950s to help establish socialism. In 1953, there were more than 91,000 Soviet experts in Xinjiang working in government agencies at all levels. They were trusted and valued by the Chinese government. In the 1950s, because of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, Russians in Xinjiang were granted dual citizenship.
We had come from the Soviet Union, where the basis of the state economy was the plan. So we explained to our Chinese comrades that the plan was the absolute basis of everything. The development of the country, the economy, and not only the economy, but of other branches of knowledge.
When the Soviet experts rushed to China to help rebuild, the Soviet Union proposed to the Chinese government to repatriate ethnic Russians to help rebuild war-torn Russia. The repatriation lasted 9 years until 1963. About 200,000 Russian Chinese were sent back to Russia.
当初有个舅舅在这儿读3工作，后面就是62年、58年、50几年，也是允许嘛，你迁回去，因为那还有也是很多就是亲戚在那儿，舅舅就带着孩子就整个一个家就移民过去。
到50年代左右，那个我有我五姨奶奶，你说那好像国家有政策，我五姨奶奶就回俄罗斯了。
苏联宣布这个由苏联这个籍的人都返回苏联。那时候一派一派就开始往苏联回了，因为大部分俄罗斯还是他们的护照什么的都苏联的那时候，甚至那时候在伊宁市有苏联的一个Совгражданство，苏联的一个代表结构。反正如果苏联国籍的在中国待的有苏联护照的人，他们出生孩子在中国给他都给证明，他拿这个证明可以拿苏联的护照，他政策是那样子的。
But not all Russian families returned.
就列宁到现斯大林的时候再说，那时候就逃难的俄罗斯人不少到中国这么来，挨饿吧，吃不上穿不上，抢面包吃都有都吃不着面包。那时候我奶奶个40多岁那时候，再有我爸有我大爷到中国，在这边落脚了。早先62年报名回国，没走了。政府说了，建国无国际有待遇，大米、豆油、面、油、摩开酒啥都有你们的，但也没有回去。
爸爸的3个姐姐，回去了那时候，就我爸爸就准备留在中国，到苏联这个领事馆去了，把护照交给他，我们就留在中国，我们不回了。那时候他们也做工作，不要这样做，你们到时候生活有困难，那个哎，不管怎么样，我们决定我们就留在中国，生活在中国，就把护照还给他，这样我们加入中国进来，形成中国人了。
From 1949 to late 1950s, China's foreign policy cooperated with the Soviet government to repatriate Russian residents. Many were keen to return and even volunteered to go to the Virgin Lands, such as Caucasus, Siberia, and Kazakhstan.
基本上，这是愿意回苏联的回去了，然后剩余的有一部分俄罗斯，特别是这个 为什么有部分没返回去？像白费军的后代，白费就害怕回去苏联是不是把他们在那里继续收拾呢？所以不敢回去。
By then, many Russians had heard about Australia's immigration policy and wanted to move there instead. Their application to move to capitalist countries quickly became a thorny issue. The Chinese authorities believed their exit is good for China, since most Russians who wanted to go to the capitalist countries were considered anti-communists. Considering the national interests, the Chinese government wanted them to leave the country, and anyone who applied to go to a capitalist country shall be authorized. But the Soviets believed that the expats going to capitalist countries would damage the image of the Soviet Union and harm the national security of both China and the Soviet Union. At the request of the Soviet Union, the Chinese authorities discouraged most Russians from moving to capitalist countries except the very old and poor. At the same time, the Soviet Union stepped up its mobilization efforts. Many who planned to move to capitalist countries returned to the Soviet Union. But things were about to change. After Stalin died in March 1953, he was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. A year later, in 1954, Khrushchev visited Beijing for the 5th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. He offered many gifts to the young nation, including loans that Mao was hungry for. Khrushchev even agreed to return the Soviet bases in Port Arthur to China, a major sticking point of Sino-Soviet relations since 1950. Despite all the friendly gestures, Mao disliked Khrushchev and came to believe that he was best qualified to lead the international communist movement. This view was not lost on Khrushchev, who believed that Mao was envious of Soviet leadership in the communist world and sought to weaken him. Upon returning from the trip to Beijing, Khrushchev declared, "Conflict with China is inevitable." Tensions grew stronger in 1956 after Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, denouncing Stalin's many crimes and initiating a process of de-Stalinization. Despite his difficulties with Stalin, Mao defended the former Soviet leader against Khrushchev's charges, largely because these criticisms threatened to weaken his own legitimacy and authority. Shortly after, Mao took an even harder line against Khrushchev, arguing that de-Stalinization is thus simply demarxification. It is revisionism.
The party started issuing documents, editorials, attacking Soviet revisionism. So from then on, along with other slogans, we had to shout down with Soviet revisionism. Later on, was down with Khrushchev.
Another flare-up occurred in 1958, when the Soviets proposed a jointly owned submarine flotilla instead of favorably responding to China's request for Soviet assistance in building an independent submarine force.
Khrushchev wanted to set up a long-wave radio station along the Chinese coast to guide Soviet submarines. He suggested setting up a joint naval fleet. This was a clear sign that the Soviets wanted to control China.
Mao's understanding was that the Soviet Union was trying to control China in the same way as it controlled countries in Eastern Europe. So he got angry with Khrushchev and said, "If you want it, I'll give you the whole coastline and I'll go back to the mountains."
In the same year, Mao, who was trying to radically transform China from an agrarian society to an industrial one, unleashed the Second Five-Year Plan. The downturn in the Sino-Soviet relations was further aggravated by Moscow's decision in 1959 to renege on its own commitment to help China with the atomic bomb. And Moscow justified its decision.
Mao Zedong said, "You are communists, and we are communists. Communists usually share. Will you give us the atomic bomb or not?" Khrushchev. "And what do you want the atomic bomb for?" We have the atomic bomb, and we will stand up for China just the same as we would for the Soviet Union. Yes, Mao said, it's true. But we are not just some tin-pot village. China is a great country, and we want to have it. Khrushchev, you don't need it, and so on. Mao then says, so you don't want to give it to us then?
Not only did nuclear assistance come to an end, but 1 year later, on July 18, 1960, the Soviet Union, without warning, informed Beijing that it would withdraw all its personnel from China. By the end of August, all Soviet experts and military specialists had left China.
At that time, the Soviet revisionists betrayed our agreements, withdrew their specialists, and cut off the supply of equipment and raw materials. Without heavy rollers, the production at the iron mills had to be halted. The workers were extremely indignant, but there was no equipment with which to make the necessary 4-meter-long cold strip rollers.
To make matters worse, the second 5-year plan backfired. It later caused the infamous Great Leap Forward. Mandatory agricultural collectivization devastated China. Famine spread across the nation. Within 3 short years, 15 to 55 million Chinese were thought to have perished, making the Great Leap Forward the largest famine in human history.
The lies of the Great Leap Forward were absolutely unbelievable. Anybody who did not speak in falsehoods was demoted or expelled from their jobs. From the time of the Great Leap Forward, all Chinese people learned to tell lies. We had to eat the husks of coarse grain, not even the grain itself. We ate leaves of trees. We all went down with hepatitis. Many peasants died of starvation. No one really knew how many.
Mao was defeated and furious. Instead of claiming responsibility, he officially named the period the 3 years of natural disasters and blamed the famine on unfair Soviet policies. With Sino-Soviet relations rapidly breaking down, China lifted travel restrictions on ethnic Russians to capitalist countries in 1956. Within 2 years, some 20,000 Russians immigrated to capitalist countries. In the first national census in 1953, the population of Russian Chinese in Xinjiang was 22,166, ranking 7th among the 13 ethnic groups. However, in the second national census in 1964, there were only 1,191 Russians, making it the ethnic group with the least population in Xinjiang. In 1962, hundreds of thousands of Xinjiang residents fled to the Soviet Union due to hunger. Beijing was enraged and shut down the Sino-Soviet border.
我小时候听我爷爷讲，那时候就是解放前，两国关系很好，可以随便开交通贸易，就是你可以上俄罗斯去，也可以俄罗斯人也可以过来，比如拿瓜子啊、糖啊，还有什么列巴呀、牛奶呀，沟通可以交换。我爸小时候跟我二爷爷去拉柴火去，挎着2马，一个是中国的马，一个是苏联的马。中国马喊停下站下就鱼，完了苏联马呢一喊站下是嘟。但是中国马听不懂苏联话，苏联马听不懂中国话，所以让他俩一块站下只能喊嘟鱼，这2马就都停下了。
The sudden closure of the Sino-Soviet border also separated many families.
他是那什么，他妈妈那时候跟他姥爷来的，来了以后，他姥爷好像是地下党还是什么，是吧？
对。
完了，他是那个好像退
去扎那些那个俄罗斯什么玩意儿？
白匪那
个。白匪。
完了，他那个腿受伤了以后，完了他就回国治疗去了，完了就把他妈就留在这儿了，说回来接他了，完了后来就因为种种原因呢，对，中苏关系不好了，完了就没来了。 完了就他妈就剩在这边。
To help these unwanted Russians escape political and economic difficulties, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees hammered out a program for people of Russian origin in China to migrate to Australia, Canada, the United States, and Brazil. The inspection of newly arrived Russians was relaxed. The Australian Immigration Office accepted even families without paperwork. Soon, waves of Russians left China.
My father and I came out to Australia first, and my mother and brother and sister stayed in Hong Kong for another year. And I went and I got my job as a junior clerk, and I was only earning £4 a week, which is $8 a week, so it was a very small wage. But then my mother wrote me letters saying, "This is Russian family. They've just come out of China. They want to go to Australia. Can you find out how to fix up the papers for them? They don't have any papers, blah, blah, blah. They have no citizenship, blah, blah, blah." So I didn't know what to do. But I was an ex-Boy Scout. So Friday night, when I finished work, I got an overnight train to Canberra. And I'd arrive at, Canberra very early in the morning, very cold and so on, The first time I got to Canberra, that was 1953, I arrived by train, and I was surprised. It was just an open field, and there was sheep everywhere, the train station. It was very undeveloped then, and I didn't know what to do. And I looked there, and there was a church spire, sticking up in the hill. I said, So I walked to it, and luckily it was a Catholic cathedral. So I went there and I found a young priest, and I explained to him, "Look, I'm here because my mother wants to help me, these Russian families and so on. What can I do?" So he then quickly started using the phone. He phoned here, he phoned there, and he said, "Okay, you've got to go here first, then you got to go there, you got to go there, you got to do this, you got to do that." And he organized all. So I was able to get that family approved. Now I can't remember. As far as I know, they were not British citizens, but they were still allowed to sneak in after I did it all. Anyway, and this happened several times. So over the year, I think I arranged for about 6 or 7 different Russian families to come here.
A Qantas jet brings home a former Qantas employee. She's Mrs. Peter Young, a lot better known as former Miss Australia, Tanya Versteg. Tanya and Peter are back in Sydney from Hong Kong, where they were married. Her husband is a Perth businessman, and Miss International Beauty says she intends to settle down in Western Australia.
In 1961, Tanya Versteg became the first migrant to win the Miss Australia title. She was born in Tianjin, China, to Russian parents, and immigrated to Australia when she was 11.
We arrived in '52, and my first memory was getting off the boat, Sydney Harbour, wonderful. When I came to Australia, I spoke very little English. I'd learned a little bit in the Russian school when I was in China, but it was very little. And arriving at Bexley North, and next morning going to school in a Chinese jacket, little Bexley North School, and feeling totally lost.
After winning the Miss Australia title in 1961, Tanya went on to win the Miss International title the next year. The victory further endeared her to the Australian public, demonstrating their pride and approval of Tanya Versteg as the embodiment of perfect Australian womanhood, and as the image of Australia as a modern nation.
It caught their imagination because I was the first of the new Australians, the first migrant to win a title in Australia. It was dream world, and then the hard work started. At the time, I felt very proud, representing a generation of young people that had come to Australia and had been accepted, and this was an important thing at the time.
Do you think that other people from other countries should be allowed to live in Australia?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they should, but...
Yes, I do, because then we get to know other people and what their food's like and their traditions and things like that.
I think they should come to Australia, yes. I think they deserve a place in the world the same as everybody else.
I think we have to.
Have to what?
Take them in. I just don't think we've just got such a big country and lots of space.
I think we have a responsibility to do something for them as soon as we were involved in the war.
I think we all have to think in terms of the one world, one humanity.
I think we should take a lot of refugees.
Why do you feel that way?
Well, I just feel it's an obligation.
Yes. Why? Because everyone should be allowed to live where they want. The world should be free.
But good times didn't last forever. In May 1964, Mao declared that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of big capitalists, a Hitler-type fascist dictatorship. They are all hooligans. They are worse than de Gaulle. 5 months later, on October 14th, when Khrushchev was vacationing in Georgia, Leonid Brezhnev took his office, becoming the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. 2 days later, on October 16th, China successfully carried out its first nuclear test.
Long live the Chinese Communist Party. Long live Chairman Mao.
With the test, China became the 5th nuclear power in the world, and the first Asian nation to possess nuclear capability. Brezhnev was alarmed. To make matters worse, he was even more hostile to China than Khrushchev. Under his rule, the Soviet Union increased its ICBM launchers from 375 to 2,490, its nuclear warheads 20-fold to 1,100, and its megatons 8-fold from 1,000 to 8,200. Brezhnev made sure he could annihilate China if needed. The tension between the two nations was reaching a fever pitch. The failure of the first and second 5-year plans and the immeasurable losses that followed created distrust of Mao among China's top leadership. His position became more and more precarious. Mao didn't want to be marginalized by the party and decided to do something about it. The year was 1966. Using the excuse that the Soviets attempt to sow discord in China, Mao unleashed the Cultural Revolution. It was a terrifying campaign to purge his enemies at all levels of society. Mao began targeting the top ranks of the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, denouncing his enemies as Soviet revisionists. Unfortunately, like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution also backfired and went out of control. About 1 million Chinese died during the revolution. Beginning with the Red August of Beijing, massacres took place nationwide. Red Guards, loyal to Mao, destroyed historical relics and artifacts, ransacking cultural and religious sites all over China.
All ideas contrary to Mao's thinking and the objects that represented them had to be destroyed. Not just Confucianism and Buddhism, but even more so foreign faiths like Christianity. Throughout the country, churches were closed, clergy unfrocked, religious symbols smashed. The statue of the Virgin Mary was replaced by a portrait of Mao. One form of worship gave way to another.
Meanwhile, tens of millions of people were persecuted, most notably Chinese President Liu Shaoqi, along with the future leader Deng Xiaoping, Marshal Peng Dehuai, and He Long were purged or exiled. Millions were accused of being members of the 5 black categories, suffering public humiliation, imprisonment, torture, hard labor, seizure of property, and sometimes execution or harassment into suicide. Intellectuals were widely persecuted in mass numbers. Schools and universities were closed. with the college entrance exams cancelled for 10 years.
The Mao personality cult did not come to full blossoming until the Cultural Revolution, when he became the so-called four greats, the great leader, great helmsman, great supreme commander, great teacher. He has replaced Stalin, and Beijing has become the center of world revolution.
宿主的政治报告，3个吗？3个呢？3个这个助手。
The Sino-Soviet relationship only got worse.
In the morning, they would hang up dummies of Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny. When it began to get dark, they took them down and started a huge bonfire at the entrance of the embassy and burnt the dummies. The Red Guards and the young people gathered around the fire and danced and yelled anti-Soviet slogans. From midnight to 6 a.m., it was time for Chinese torture. For 15 minutes they would stop and we would start falling asleep, exhausted by the noise. Then they would begin yelling again for 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes they would start and stop, all night. Then at 6 a.m., the noise would begin and continue all day.
Since ethnic Russians were often in high administrative occupations, during the Cultural Revolution, they came under attack not only as a social class, but as a suspicious ethnic category. Orthodox churches were demolished and burned, with the entire country locked down. Immigration was no longer possible.
我爷爷搁这黑龙江那是开船，他是个船长。有一次开船，把船就给潜住了。当时中国船很少，他自己也出不来。正好附近嘛有个苏联船，我爷爷就划个小船，就上苏联船呢，把那个苏联船给叫过来。 把我爷爷这个船就给拉出来了，拉出来以后，就因为这个事儿吧，到文化大革命的时候，就因为这个事儿，那个我爷爷就挨处分了。人家就问你凭什么划个小船过去就能把苏联船叫过来？你跟那边是不是什么关系？是不是有联系？就把我爷爷就给打成叫休特，苏休特嘛，特务了。 特务了，完了，戴着大高帽子，游街。完，我爸爸因为这个事儿吧，我爸爸搁这个村原来是个小队长，因为这个事儿也给刷勺子撸了。
像过去这边还是有不少东正教堂的吧，在这个。
有一个。
现在还有。
没有了，现在因为文革时期啊，它这个就没有了。现在好像是我们这又建了个古镇，还在建设中，应该是。 在就是那个计划范围内，要就是建一个。
就是想想我们以前多可怜哦，连个照片都没有。因为我父亲特别年轻就去世了，在最早呢，他有文化大革命受迫害，就进监狱，前后10年，回来没几年就病了完了以后就去世了。 所以我父亲的照片特别少。这张照片是我父亲和我的2个姐姐还有一个哥哥，他年轻时候照的。 那阵还没有我和我那个小哥呢。我还在我妈妈肚子里的时候，我爸爸就被抓走了。等我爸爸出来，我都上学了。我刚结婚没几年，我的孩子才1岁，我爸爸就去世了，病了9年，母亲把他伺候了9年，走掉了。
During the Cultural Revolution, Russians were not allowed to speak Russian or practice religion. Parents spoke Chinese to their kids. Any Russian cultural symbols were avoided. They were also listed as members of the 5 black categories. Aside from being publicly humiliated and tortured, Russian kids were not allowed to join the army, go to school, or get jobs in China. Soon, Russians went from the most educated ethnic group in China to the least educated. Many of them were illiterate throughout their lives. There was no future. The revolution even reached British Hong Kong.
It was actually 1967 when they had the riots that got bad. And I remember we used to live on Broadwood Road, which was from Happy Valley up to Tai Hang Road. And it was only a one-way street then. So if you met a car coming the opposite way, one of you had to back up to let the other car go. And there was a horrible bridge that was, it was sort of like at right angles. And the taxis used to hate coming up there because they'd scratched their Mercedes or whatever. But there was a communist school over the bridge. And the kids would put stuff in packets and they'd leave them on the road. So we wouldn't know if they were bombs or if they were just lapsap. And so we'd have to call the police. And I remember one time I was waiting for a friend in the bank, and I was just standing where the lions are, and there was a crowd of protesters coming and a crowd of police coming, and one of the protesters threw acid or something onto the policeman, and he took off his uniform and jumped into the pool in Statue Square to get the water to take the acid off. So I was hiding behind the lion because they were shooting at the protesters. It was very exciting.
大大起来，不要做奴隶的人民，вставай тот, кто не хочет быть рабом. 把我们的血肉筑成我们的新的长城, построим из наших костей, из нашего мяса новую китайскую стену. Ну, это уже был гимн Китайской Народной Республики.
After leaving Harbin in 1951, Vera didn't return to China until 1966. She was the translator to the Czechoslovakian ambassador on a state visit.
Только когда была культурная революция. Ой, я там пережила такое, вы не представляете, там с голода люди умирали. Когда я туда приехала, то только началось такое, что первое, что было в 1966 году, у них был голод. В 1966 году они пригласили, вот первое мое впечатление, я как переводчица иду с женой посла по официальному приглашению посмотреть выставку достижений народного хозяйства во время голода. И у них работы дежавю не было, так они выращивали твердые сорта деревьев и вот такие вот вилы. Из природы они выжимали, чтобы выжить, не пропасть голодом. Нам подбросили в посольство, один, который здесь учился, письмо, где я своими глазами видела и переводила послу. Во время культурной революции только по обеим берегам Янцзы-Тянь с голоду умерло 80 миллионов китайцев. Кто это знает? Никто там.
When the editor of the Rudo Pravo, a newspaper sponsored by the Czechoslovak Communist Party, arrived in Beijing, Vera showed him around and took him to Tiananmen Square.
Туда приехал редактор газеты «Руде Право». По пути из Японии приехал и мне дал посол, как сказать, задачу, чтобы я его повезла вот в этот вот Тяньаньмэнь, это огромная площадь, где у них там трибуна. И я там с ним стою, я его читаю, и тут вдруг приходит одна китаянка, а они брали пример из длинного похода. Знаете, что Мао Цзэдун с юга аж туда куда-то провел эту армию. А заядлые китайчата делали то же самое. Из провинций шли и вот дошли до Пекина. И в это время видели какую-то европейку и подошла и: ты что здесь делаешь? Я говорю: как что, видишь, читаю, это же Чжоу Цзунли, это ваш премьер. Ты ревизионистка, начала кричать: друзья, это наши враги. И вдруг мы оказались окружены. Столько их было. А у меня был и фотоаппарат. Я только что зарядила пленку, и недалеко стояла наша машина. Мы скорее в машину. То этот шофер наш говорит: вы от них не отделаетесь. Он говорит: тогда давай фильм. И я этот только что заряженный ему через щелочку дала. Так что уже можно было, что я чего-то там плохого от них не отвезу. И тут вдруг появились в Кожанках какие-то 4 человека. А у них уже, наверное, кто-то им сказал, что же иностранцы здесь. Так что они начали расталкивать хоть такой маленький треугольник, чтобы машина могла старт взять. И вот я помню, когда мы двинулись, то эта толпа на это стекло придавила китайчонка, и вот так вот нос даже раздавили ему. Потому что они накажут ревизионисты, почему мы не признаем маоцзэдунские идеи.
我奶奶那个意思呢，就是我奶奶跟我爸说俄语，我爷爷跟我爸说汉语，这样呢就俄语汉语都会，两国语言都会多好。但是我爷爷就是坚决不同意，他绝对不学俄语了，不说俄语，就是到中国来只能说汉语。所以就因为这样，我爸跟我姑姑都不会说俄语，那他们不会，我那就到我这儿，到我们姊妹就更不用说了。
Many Russian families in Hong Kong were also de-Russianizing.
I didn't have any Russian classmates. My sister was born in 1939. There were a lot of Russian kids around her age then, and she spoke Russian, and she had lots of Russian friends, but they all left. The parents sort of left around late 1950s, early 1960s, and then there were very, very, very few Russian people there. So there was no incentive for me to learn Russian or to do anything. And my parents wanted us to grow up as English children. So, not Russian.
Aside from distorting people's lives, the fervor of the Cultural Revolution further escalated the Sino-Soviet conflict. It brought all of China's misgivings over its unfair relationship with the Soviets to a crisis point. On March 2, 1969, Chinese troops ambushed and killed a group of Soviet border guards on Zhenbao Island, one of the many disputed islands on the Ussuri River. For China, the attack on Zhenbao was designed to deter future Soviet provocations. By initiating a limited attack, China sought to forcibly demonstrate that it could not be bullied and that a future Soviet attack would be fiercely resisted. The Soviet Union, however, received a very different message. Moscow interpreted China's actions as aggressive and emblematic of an increasingly revisionist and antagonistic regime in Beijing.
Границы Союза Советских Социалистических Республик священны и неприкосновенны.
Что с ними делать? Стрелять?
What could we do? It wouldn't be nice to shoot them.
Как выгонять?
But how could we get rid of them?
Тоже трудно решить вопрос.
It was a difficult question to solve, And so things got worse.
Тут виноваты, конечно,
The Chinese were mostly to blame.
не виноваты, конечно, китайцы.
On March 15th, China and Soviet Union fought again on Jinbao Island, this time with much larger forces and firepower. In the following months, Moscow and Beijing fought several more battles along the border. The Chinese soon realized that their plan of deterring the Soviets backfired again.
The Soviet Union had a nuclear arsenal and 1 million troops along the border between the Soviet Union and China. North of Beijing were flat plains. And if the Soviet Union were to attack China, within a week they would be in Beijing with their tanks.
More serious conflicts took place in summer. Between June 1st and July 31st, China accused the Soviets of inciting as many as 429 incidents on the border. The largest and most violent clash since Jinbao Island occurred on August 13th in the Tilikti area of Xinjiang. Soviet troops using APCs and tanks, supported by 2 helicopters, ambushed and killed 38 Chinese soldiers. According to a Soviet official, the attack was motivated to signal to Beijing that they couldn't continue to get away with provocations on the border. For China, the Tilikti incident was particularly worrisome because officials in Beijing believed that China was especially vulnerable in this region. Two weeks after the clash in Tilikti, on August 27th, CIA Director Richard Helms told the press that Moscow had been approaching foreign governments to inquire about their reaction to a potential Soviet preemptive strike on China. Upon learning of Helms' announcement, China issued orders for war preparations. Beijing instructed citizens in major cities to dig underground cities and stockpile necessities. Emotions, stress, and suspicion of Soviet intentions took hold in China, particularly for Mao Zedong and Vice President Lin Biao. By mid-October 1969, China had become so concerned about a Soviet nuclear strike that the central leadership fled Beijing. Mao fled to Wuhan in central China. Lin fled to Suzhou in eastern China. On October 18th, China placed its rudimentary nuclear forces on full alert, the first and only time this order has been issued. Despite its overwhelming advantage in weaponry, the Soviet Union had its own concerns.
Siberia and the Far East was sparsely populated. So what if the Chinese millions began pouring in? Writers had warned before about the Yellow Peril, that the Chinese would come right through Russia and conquer Europe.
According to Arkady Shevchenko, the highest-ranking Russian defector, the Politburo was terrified that the Chinese might make a large-scale intrusion into Soviet territory. A nightmare vision of invasion by millions of Chinese made the Soviet leaders almost frantic. Given China's vast population and deep knowledge and experience in guerrilla warfare, if the Soviets launched a major attack on China, they would surely become mired in an endless war. On October 20th, after 8 months of violence and threats, China and the Soviet Union finally sat down at the negotiating table. Negotiations were protracted and complex, lasting several decades before a final agreement was reached. Fearful of Moscow's belligerence, Mao wanted better relations with America. America's new president, Richard Nixon, although a lifelong anti-communist, came to a similar conclusion. To limit Soviet power and end the Vietnam War, he wanted to draw closer to China. With his new national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon developed a foreign policy that exploited the hostility between the communist giants. Beijing's first sign of thaw came during a ping-pong match in 1971. While playing in Japan, the American team was suddenly invited to China.
I think it's a wonderful opportunity to go to China because not very many people get there, and I feel it's a great opportunity to play against the top players and be able to take some of this knowledge home, and I think it's also a step in our political relations with China.
The American team lost 5 out of 6 matches and went home with the movies that offered the first glimpse of China to most Americans for 20 years. ping-pong diplomacy led to an even greater breakthrough. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger went on a tour of Asia. His most important mission was kept secret, a visit to Beijing to prepare a way for rapprochement with China. And 7 months later,
Premier Zhou Enlai moves forward to greet the first American president to set foot on Chinese soil. East meets West as a handshake bridges 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility.
Richard Nixon, the lifelong anti-communist, quoted Mao's own words.
So many deeds cry out to be done, and always urgently. The world rolls on. Time passes. 10,000 years are too long. Seize the day. Seize the hour. This is the hour. This is the day.
Exactly 3 months later, on May 22, 1972, Nixon and Henry Kissinger arrived in Moscow to begin a summit meeting with Brezhnev, becoming the first American president to visit Moscow. On September 9, 1976, Mao passed away.
Chairman Mao, with the deepest grief, we solemnly pledge. Forever loyal to you, we'll rally closely around the Party Central Committee, firmly implement your line in army building, strengthen the army, heighten our vigilance, and enhance preparedness against war. Be ready at all times to wipe out any enemy who dares to intrude, and defend the Party Central Committee and the great socialist motherland to the death. We are determined to liberate Taiwan. We will consolidate and develop the achievements of the great proletarian cultural revolution, and always advance along your revolutionary line.
Within a month, the Cultural Revolution ended. Deng Xiaoping came to power, resolved the mess left by Mao, and restored relations with all parties.
In the space of 2 months, he visited 6 Asian countries, including Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. There he witnessed at first hand the rapid regional development.
The things Deng saw and heard while visiting developed capitalist countries made him realize that if China was to catch up with the rest of the world, it had to find a path of development adapted to its own situation.
Deng reformed China and suspended all the radical policies implemented during the 60s and 70s. Economic development replaced class struggle as the center of people's daily life.
Deng Xiaoping came along at just the right moment. He said, it doesn't matter what color the cat is, as long as it's rich and so on. Great man, Deng Xiaoping. He's one of my heroes. But what happened, of course, was that the Chinese people were able to be dragged out of poverty at the most incredibly rapid rate. Nobody's ever seen that rapid rise ever before in history.
Soviet-Chinese relations were easing, but still far from good.
What happened one morning? One at a time, from Chinese.
One morning, the author and his wife came down to breakfast.
We'll get from the report, from the article.
Goods are of poor quality, and the service there is also bad.
The services are intolerable. The services are intolerable. Now, what are Soviet goods so poorly made, and why are their services so bad?
Has degenerated social imperialist.
The Soviet Union, under the Brezhnev rule of the revisionist clique, has degenerated into what? Yes, has degenerated into a social imperialist country.
In 1977, an American reporter went to Fudan University asking the English major students what their impression of the Soviet Union was. It appeared the tension was still there.
What do you think of the Russians? Are the Russians really so bad?
Yes, I think the Soviet Union is very bad, and the rule of the Brezhnev clique.
The revisionist clique.
Because I think the Soviet Union is no longer a socialist country. It has degenerated into the social imperialist country.
In 1978, Deng Xiaoping passed the Opening Up policy, which improved diplomatic and economic relations between China and many Western countries, including Australia. In June 1978, the State Council and the Overseas Chinese Department relaxed their previously strict requirements on migration. The new regulation stated that Chinese citizens were free to migrate abroad. At about the same time, Australia also introduced changes to its immigration policy, which legally enabled more Russian Chinese citizens to migrate. In 1973, the White Australia policy was abandoned. The Australian-Chinese Family Reunion Agreement was introduced, allowing Chinese migrants to sponsor their family members to enter Australia.
澳洲那阵就是给中国，就是给这个中国的这个俄罗斯族，就是给了一个非常宽的一个政策，就是移民，就是你去了以后有什么好的待遇呀啥的。因为咱们就是我们不说中国多落后，咱们在70年代比较还是有一点那个啥，有点困难嘛大家呢就想他那的条件也好也优越，而且他那人口少嘛，就是让我们这边的俄罗斯允许移民，他就可以，如果说你在那儿，你是我的朋友，你给我发个邀请函，你就可以邀请我去，给我担保，你当担保人我就去，反正就是大部分人就移民了。
然后剩下的俄罗斯，特别是相当一部分红血儿，也就已经跟中国的人嫁到一块儿了。这样的家庭相当一部分以后又开始往澳大利亚走了，往澳大利亚走。像白费军的那阵子不敢回苏联的，都往澳大利亚开始走了。那时候澳大利亚给了一个政策，反正是白种人愿意从中国出来，他就路费都给你包，签证都给你发，愿意我想去，这个字就够了，他就给你签证拿过来，路都包，拿到澳大利亚给你安排房子那个这个，然后你有了生意慢慢给他还，给你贷款给，是这样子的，相当一部分就大部分就走了。
All Russian families, no matter where they decide to immigrate, must lay over in Hong Kong, the gateway to the outside world. Since the immigration policy was relaxed in the 70s and 80s, most Russians stayed only for a few days, weeks, or months, enough for them to take a medical checkup and prepare the paperwork for moving to Australia, Canada, or South America. Lindy and Nona had all grown up. graduated from KG5, married, and left Hong Kong. Lindy moved to the Netherlands, and Nona moved to Perth, Australia. In January of 1974, retired George and Lila also left Hong Kong, the city they had called home for 27 years. They moved to Perth, where they lived for the rest of their lives. By 1988, nearly all ethnic Russians had left China.
像那个第二代啊，就是我们父母那一代啊，几乎都快没有了，没有。就第三代像我们这样子的，为啥在这个塔城聚集的人少呢？比如说我们的孩子考大学走了，远嫁到外面了，你父母是不是就随着儿女走了？全国各地都走了。你像这样小城市，你像孩子都有自己的理想，你出去了以后，上学了以后，都几乎是不回来。不回来呢，成家了以后，父母是不是都跟着孩子走，帮孩子去？像中国父母都是以孩子当坚强的，就是后盾，做好，打好后给做后勤保障都给做好。
剩下的就不多了。那时候也就是70年代，然后80年代，就往澳大利亚还走的呢。80几年就这个政策也停止了。85年嘛，87年就把这个政策澳大利亚就停止掉了，再不接受。
China under Deng Xiaoping went through dramatic changes, and nothing short of an economic miracle took place.
同志们好！中国人民解放军全体志愿同志们、全国同胞们、同志们和朋友们，在伟大的中华人民共和国成立35周年的这个光荣时刻，我想为进行社会主义现代化建设，为完成祖国统一大业，为保卫祖国安全而奋斗的同志们、同胞们、朋友们，致以最热烈的节日祝贺。
Deng and his allies opened China to foreign investments and technology, and introduced its vast labor force to the global market, thus turning China into the world's fastest-growing economy. As China continued to deepen its opening up policy, the US-China relationship was changing drastically. In the same school where 7 years ago students were denouncing the Soviet Union, President Reagan was invited to speak.
Mr. President, I'm the student of international politics, so I would like to know, after your trip to China, what measures are you going to take to further improve Sino-American relations?
I guess it comes down to something that's a favorite saying of mine. We only get in trouble when we're talking about each other, not when we're talking to each other. So we're going to be talking to each other a great deal.
6 years after Mao's death, Brezhnev died.
And his widow Victoria, his daughter and his son said goodbye.
3 years after the death of Brezhnev in 1985, the Politburo elected Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The hostility between the two nations was finally coming to an end.
Today, Mikhail Gorbachev became the first Soviet leader in 30 years to sit down with the leaders of China. Together, they agreed to normalize the relationship between the two largest communist countries in the world, to change things.
Both Deng Xiaoping and Gorbachev proclaimed that the meeting was the beginning of normalized state-to-state relations. 2 years later, on December 30th, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the relations between the two were fully restored by President Jiang Zemin and President Boris Yeltsin.
现在双方又合理地解决了中俄两国的国界的东端勘界的所有问题。
Представляете, создается такой мощный букет.
Things are finally turning around for the Russian Chinese.
过去的爷爷老爷他们是华侨，归国华侨。像我的父母是归侨，我们是侨眷，我们这一代第三代是属于侨眷了，父母属于归侨了。你看共产党政策非常好，你像我们父母是归侨，他每个月这个归侨他都有在工资里面给你相对来说给你加一部分钱，你属于归侨，国家有这个补贴。
Many Russians started a new career.
早先挣工分种地，做买卖没挣啥本钱，回来沈州就拍戏。我当时我肯定他看电视看那挺有兴趣的。上海导演就张静他哥哥他们来找的，我们没想到他们来找拍戏了。那时候拍戏，咱一开始不知道怎么干法好，导演语言唠嗑，拍戏这方面人家告诉怎么解答、怎么解释、怎么啥的。哎，这一拍戏，我这我这也挺好嘛，一天给5撮钱的时候，1000多块钱回来，下回再找我还去。
我09年第一次拍。我就没演过好人，我跟你说，我就没演过好人。演警察都是坏警察，都是抓男主角的那些警察，长得就不像好人呗，还用说吗？没惹我，揍。
As China opened up, Nicholas' brother-in-law, Alexander, rose to fame quickly, performing accordion all over China.And is world famous for his accordion collection.
在新疆伊宁市的俄罗斯族居民亚历山大·谢尔盖维奇·扎祖林从小跟着父亲学习修理手风琴，他用40多年的时间收藏了800多架手风琴。那现在他建起了一个手风琴博物馆。
这是中国和捷克的合作的手风琴，1940年到1950年，中国和捷克的。最早的手风琴，那个也是东方红，上海。
The increasing trade volume between the two nations has created a growing demand for Russian translators. Many Xinjiang Russians started working as translators. Some even reconnected with their families in Russia.
俄罗斯我去过，也就是。给人家当翻译，跟公司也出去过当翻译，转一转看一看，然后弹琴也去过，好长时间我们失去了这个联系了，时间长了，文革时候也不容易这个来往了，这个来信了，说不定就问题大了，就不写了不写了，这样就失去关系了啊，不联络了，然后到10来年，突然就有人，这个就算是我爸爸的姐姐，最小的3个姐姐，她的孩子一直想联系跟我们。2010年，在这个我们党和政府的领导下，加强这个跟俄罗斯边境贸易，就吸引国外的这个生意界的这经济界的这个文化界的各界别的人都邀请了，圣诞节就在我们这儿过来，我们加强这个生意，加强这个文化联系，将近100个人叫过来了，媒体的也有，反正就过来了，在这里就过了个圣诞节，我们领导都组织的，当然我在里面也操作帮助翻译什么的。结果他们回去以后，在那里登录了有些信息， 已经是过了俄罗斯圣诞节，从国外来了很多人，这个卢尼奥夫尼古拉在这里组织什么的，把我的姓名提到了，正好那个报纸，我的那个表哥都看到了，哎，卢尼奥夫尼古拉这姓跟我一样，是不是那个？就是我们曾经在中国的，是不是他们的？这个不是我的亲戚，就开始想了，然后写了一封信，自己的历史，妈妈的历史，妈妈说的话，就听到了什么，这就讲了一下，然后通过一个到这里做生意的人给了那个人过来了，他认识我呢。给我拿过来了信，我给爸爸读了一下，哎，对啊，他一看这个信，他讲述的那些故事，原来是，哎，对啊，就是这样啊，是啊，我一看，哦，就算是亲戚给找到了，就给他打了个电话联系了一下，然后就他过来了到这儿过来了给他。邀请函什么的都过来了，我的爷爷在这里埋葬的，他过来了，他的坟都看了，然后他又介绍了，还有他们，我父亲的3个姐姐嘛，一个就跑到俄罗斯嘛，2个在哈萨克斯坦，他又给了联系哈萨克斯坦的这些联系，然后我们也打电话联系了一下，他又给我发了邀请函，全家过去了，他们2家就有见了个面。哎呀，咋说呢？时间长了，意识上，知道这是你的算是，表哥表姐。感情上没有那么深，我们在这里有表哥表姐，好像亲戚一样，那个是亲戚，不过慢慢时间长了，也有点感觉了，刚开始好像是不是自己的人一样。
Apart from farming and acting, Petrov also has a successful streaming business on TikTok, selling Russian goods to his viewers.
这样不雷点儿，这白瞎了。高粱的太渴。行，不对，白下里来一个。哎，这一大口，哎呀，口有点大了。
In the summer of 2014, a TV program sponsored a trip to Vladivostok for him and his family. It means a lot to Petrov, as he would be the first in his family to set foot in Russia in 88 years.
照一张相，照那个列宁，给你们10分钟的时间了，可以照相了。
快照，地上照，录个海鸥。
不着急。
要海鸥飞了。
我真的不相信你不是俄罗斯人。
你还，安娜，你还不相信呢？
不相信。
老家太阳也会这么晒。哎呀，爸爸，这是老家呀。爸爸，喂，是啊，我就踩到老家地方。
从小爷爷跟我唠，爸爸也跟我唠，那个其实很期待回去，其实对我意义很大，因为毕竟4辈人从过了那天开始，从我老爷爷过了那天开始，就再没有踏上过那块土地。所以说我有生之年，只要我活着，必须得上那个土地上踩一脚，留个脚印。我最想学的就是俄语，就是老家我回来了。
After visiting the triumphal gates of Nikolai, Petrov broke down with grief.
那个地方是我感觉我最应该去的地方，凯旋门，就是尼古拉来过这儿。尼古拉二世毕竟是他这个俄罗斯的末代皇帝嘛，我老爷爷就是他的手下。我们为什么到中国呢？就是因为他被杀了，清剿，剩那些他的兵全杀，不得不去中国。这个太不好说了，哎呀，这心情有点烂了，还高兴，还兴奋，还压抑，还想掉眼泪。我现在都有点，你说得有点受不了。别唠这个话题了。有点忍不住。老他妈复杂了，这心情真的老复杂了。
Because of their small population, most people in Russia and China don't even know their existence.
我当年年轻的时候去北京的时候，人就说我们是新疆人。
没错。
完了就问说，就说你们那个哈密瓜好不好吃？我都没吃过哈密瓜，我也没去过新疆的时候。完了后来我说我是东北这种内蒙古这边的，然后就跟他们解释，俄罗斯族。完了有的吧还不知道俄罗斯族，像我一个朋友去海南了，他长得也魁梧，个儿也高。完了，这个在机场的时候，人就不让他那个安检，就说他是警察都不知道俄罗斯族。完了那个就说啥就不让他那个就是那个过那个安检。完了后来呢，完了往后边一报人一查，从电脑上一查，完了一查是确实是他因为他身份证上写着俄罗斯族，他们没见过这个俄罗斯族，对，没接触过。你拿身份证，人说你是假冒的，中国没有俄罗斯族。后来查出来了啊，是内蒙古什么地方。
The scars left by the past have made many Russian Chinese dislike their European looks and long to be Sinicized.
人家都说什么黑头，我自己黄头发，感觉自己觉着心里不舒服，不好看呢，人家就欺负呗。
那玩意儿，我妈这一辈子头发，这里边头发是黄头的，始终是染黑头发，就想当中国人是。
就这样，养那么好几10年了。
我爸他们哥5个，全找就是那啥，俄罗斯就全通婚的俄罗斯男。
他也是这个民族，我也这个民族，谁也不用笑话谁。
咱这样人吧，我从小就受我爷爷还有我爸这个熏陶吧，就是。因为咱再早吧，咱这样人可是受歧视，就是你特别是都有过这个经历，也不好过。完了吧，我就寻思我找个中国人吧，就把这孩子血统一点就是啊，我儿子再找中国人，我到他的后代再估计到我孙子从孙子那一辈就改过来，把血统都改过来。反正吧，也就是你不想改也得改了。因为咱们这样的越来越少了，
是越来越少。
你不是因为像我的年轻，像我这么像的，虚荣县找不出几个。
是。
等你儿子长大，你再找那么大小姑娘还没有。
没有对。
你这找汉族人，
你要说我现在换掉这个面孔，我现在说我希望换掉那是假的。如果原来的话，可能我希望这样，就是让自己变成真正的普通人。但现在他这个面孔现在给我创造收入了，这个面孔把你都给吸引来了，你说我还换它干啥呀？是不是？我一年我因为这个那个我能挣着钱了。
Decades had passed. Most of them had left China, and few stayed. But wherever they are and whatever they do, the Russian diaspora is in a perpetual struggle to find a safe space. carefully shedding the traces of Russia in themselves, and trying to fit in with whatever land they call home. Russian Chinese, with a population of less than 5,000, are rapidly disappearing. Together with their past, they will no longer exist in 2 or 3 generations. They suffered, they endured, and they are being forgotten. The 20th century was unforgiving for the Russian Chinese. The damage was immeasurable and irredeemable, but meaning can be found in the individual stories of those who lived through it. Stories of courage and love, and perseverance, of understanding and accepting, and ultimately, reconciliation.
哎，大舅过年好，大舅，哎，给妈过年好，接老爷子，接老爷子，
叫大爷，
大爷，家哪儿的？
家兵团
的啊，兵团的，对，啊，王维栋，王维栋他爸，对，啊，那个老翻译嘛，啊，这原来没见过，这个知道，抽烟来，
抽根烟，抽烟，
来个。过年挺好，大爷，挺好。
抽颗是这烟吧？那不有吗？
啊，对，有老家烟，是咱老家的。
抽一颗你们老家的烟。
老家烟冲。
啊。
你大爷现在俄语还可以啊？那个咱老家歌，有会唱啊？
莫斯科郊外晚上。
哎，你唱一个呗，我就光搁电视上听，但是真
我唱你听这词儿啊，你会吧？
我不会，我搁电视听过，但是我从来没听过这咱自己家人唱。
4段这个歌。
是4段。
唱一个行。
Не слышны в саду даже шорохи, все здесь замерло до утра. Если бы знали вы, как мне дороги подмосковные вечера. Если бы знали вы, как мне дороги подмосковные вечера.
Речка движется и не движется, вся из лунного серебра. Песня слышится и не слышится в эти тихие вечера. Песня слышится и не слышится в эти тихие вечера. А рассвет уже все заметнее. Так, пожалуй, будь добра, не забудь ты эти летние подмосковные вечера. Не забудь ты эти летние подмосковные вечера.